Hello and welcome to this video on turning an olive tree into a bonsai. Olive trees are a solid beginner and novice tree. They are resilient to most mistreatment and require almost no extra care and attention. Further, they can grow very well with little to no care, while also producing fruit. Or at least some example species can produce fruit, just not all. To make an olive bonsai, you need almost nothing. In our case, we have several cuttings and air layer specimens. Another is a nursery specimen. We have these three examples so you can see how there's almost no need for special trees or stock for this work. You can use almost anything. The best case scenario is a Yamadori specimen that is harvested from an olive grove that is replanting or similar, but that is not an easily accessed option for most people. So we will work with something more common. Just remember that the actions and steps we take here apply to a more advanced stock too. The first thing to note is that olives grow from a tuberous mass at the bottom. This is a slightly wider area, let's say, kind of like a nabari but much more round rather than flared. This tuberous mass can be cut in half, horizontally, to create a flat and more typically bonsai style base to the trunk. And you can also use the other side of it to create a very wide growing, almost pollarded or coppice-like tree. It's useful particularly if you're looking at making something sort of like a raft but not quite. If you're going to do this, make your cuts and similar in early spring, particularly when we're talking about the root mass or across the root ball. This will give the roots time to regrow and support the rest of the tree. An especially important element, as you'll be cutting away most of the roots when doing this, for the top half of the mass, and for the bottom half there'll be no leaves to speak of, so both sides will need to compensate for the loss. With some nursery stock, you may find it is a graft, and this is certainly one way to remove the signs of a graft. Or in this case, you can either just prune away the root ball and then plant out in a wide shallow pot or training pot. The choice is very much yours in this respect. If you're happy with the graft to be there, and you don't consider it an issue, you can forgo that entirely. For air layers and cuttings, it isn't an issue at all anyway, but you will find that the tree has no nabari to speak of. In this case, the only solution is waiting. You want to get it started with an air layer bulb or similar plastic pot. Later, transfer it to a growing pot that is wide and shallow. That will help you considerably in the development of the nabari. Sacrifice branches and similar are also another option, but they're probably better used later on. With the basic growing out of the way, we now have the pruning. The trees tend to have the same basic requirements, and that is almost nothing at all. But you do need to have certain things done when styling them, and that is you want to remove the branches that are, well, there for the styling purposes, or more importantly, not there for the styling purposes. This is the normal front, straight up and straight down branches as with any bonsai. On the basis that we are making three different styles, we'll start with the first of these, a formal upright. This is not necessarily the most suitable style. Understand, for some specimens it works extremely well. The trunk is growing almost perfectly straight, and everything just lines up perfectly. The next is a more common format, and that's the informal upright, and this is much more appropriate, and that's simply because the nature of the tree and how it grows, it contributes itself better or lends itself better to the informal upright format. And the final is a slant or a windswept, and this is not necessarily the most cooperative, but similar in some ways to the informal upright and the formal upright. There are parts of it that either can just work, as with the formal upright, or depending on how you want to look at this, it's more naturally occurring, particularly when you look at where olive trees grow. To make all this happen, we're going to go through the usual steps. For the formal upright, we take the odd branches on each side and prune them away. This leaves the remaining odd branches in place and some of the rear branches. We also prune away the very top to create a more flat apex, and given we want to keep this relatively small and neat, it's necessary. The next option is the informal upright. This involves the same basic process, odd branches on each side and every other pair has a back branch. However, you need to also bend the trunk, and this is the big problem. The challenge is to match the trunk bend with the branches, and so you either need to have a very good idea about how far you can push it before pruning, or the ideal situation is to bend the trunk first and then prune away the branches you don't need. This can be harder to do. if working with Yamadori or less developed trees. The more developed a tree, it's better up to a point. And obviously, the less developed a tree, the less branches you have, and therefore the longer you have to wait for any results. There's a very narrow ideal range. And ideal as in you don't need to worry about anything, but there's a much broader working range. That is, how developed it is versus how much work you have to do to turn it into an informal upright, if it's not already partway there. The final form we have is the windswept or aslant. To do this, we are going to start training from the same place as a formal upright. However, unlike the formal upright where we have the left-right back process, we start the trunk by bending it at a slight angle. Or if we're fortunate, and in this case we are, we can plant it at an angle. We now need to prune away the branches on one side of it so it grows slightly more on the other side of the tree. This would be like, for instance, if it was being pushed by the wind over, and as a result, part of the trunk didn't really have exposure to sunlight. This creates an area of the trunk on one side that doesn't have any real branches to speak of. It's basically bare. The other is a fairly complete side of the trunk, let's say, and all the branches are where and how they should be. And then on the other side, we eventually start up again and they grow normally. But one thing we need to be very conscientious of when doing this is that all the branches need to be pushed in a particular way to make it look like the tree has been consistently pushed by the wind in one direction. That means the side of the tree where it's a top to bottom branch structure, it needs to be more compressed down. That is, it must look like the wind has been pushing them more, forcing them towards the ground, whereas the other side, it needs to be more almost out to a side in a straight manner. Not quite straight, but much more than the other side, and making it look like that's the side where the wind has caught those branches and has been pulling them away from the tree. Now, the last aspect to this is where we shift to the wiring. Olive trees need to be wired to some extent, and you'll have seen us working through that in these videos. However, the branches can be very uncooperative, and that's why we have to use wire. It's the only solution. Unlike some species, the olive tree will harden off as the tree enters into winter. This will be when you can remove the wire, and you do want to remove the wire. Make sure it's taken off before spring when the branches start growing again. That's because the wire cuts into the branches with the spring growth and flow of sap, which causes it to enlarge just slightly, enough that the wire can cut into those branches, and that will cause scarring that takes a very long time to heal and go away. The other thing, as we mentioned, is that the branches do harden off. This means that older branches are far less cooperative when being wired. In fact, it's arguable that you're more likely to break a branch than you are to be able to bend it. But there are ways around that, just not in this video. But that's the key. Going into late autumn and winter, when the cold weather starts, the branches harden and they become fairly well set in place, so you can remove wire. Just be aware of that. The benefits of the olives we've shown you are that all three of the trees can produce olives. Now, you obviously won't get very much out of it. You're not going to get a massive yield like you would from a olive tree in your garden, but we will get a small and reliable number. We will need to take some steps, particularly around pruning, to ensure that if we want to display this with the olives on it, that we have flowers at the right time and so on, which again, outside the scope of this video. But just be aware that for a purely exhibition level yield of olives, this will get you there without any issue. If you want more than that, you'll first of all need to grow a much larger specimen, but also you'll need to take much more care than we do for these when we're talking about it as a purely exhibition specimen. And now we have 3 olive trees styled in 3 different ways, and the basics can be used for just about any other olive tree used in any other style if you so wish, and more likely better than we can trying to do this for a video. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.